Welcome everyone to part one of Module 6. Module 6 is going to be talking about developmental psychology. So we're going to start just kind of introducing it a little bit, and then we're actually going to jump right into our first basically stage of development, or our first kind of group, the way we're going to chunk off these different sections here. So the big question to start off with obviously is, what is developmental psychology? What does this mean? What is this referring to? So developmental psychology is a branch of psychology that studies the physical, cognitive, and social change throughout the lifespan. So again, there's three kind of core pieces, but it's all about how do we change as human beings from, even before birth, as we're developing in the womb, all the way through until the death at the end of our lives, right? What are the changes that are happening? How are things staying the same? Those are all things that we're going to be looking at if we were developmental psychologists. Now, there are kind of three, what we might call major issues, or three big focuses that we tend to see on developmental psychology. So there's kind of like three questions, I guess you could call them. So we have nature versus nurture, which we already talked about quite a bit before. We have continuity versus stages, which we haven't brought up, but we'll get into in just a moment. And we also have stability versus change. So again, a developmental psychologist is going to be, generally speaking, focusing on one or more of these questions in what they're doing. Where a biological psychologist might, or a neuroscientist, right, might be focusing on a specific cell, and they might not really focus a ton on differences or how things go out throughout life, right? They just want to know, what does this cell do? A developmental psychologist is really going to be focusing on, okay, what happens over time? How do we change? How do we stay the same? And those are kind of the questions we're going to be looking at. So again, kind of just delving a little bit deeper into these three questions. So the first one, nature versus nurture, we've already talked about quite a bit here in this class. But the basic question is, how do our genetic inheritance and experiences interact to influence development? So again, what things come from our genetics, what things come from our experiences, what things are a combination, and how do those things, how do they interact with one another and then influence us in obviously a million different ways. Our second major thing is continuity and stages. So what parts of our development is gradual and continuous, and what changes happen abruptly in separate stages. So we'll see kind of specific examples of this as we go through class and different theories. But for example, when you look at a child growing from the age of 1 to 15, one of the questions might be, obviously there's going to be changes in that time span, right? Physical changes, emotional stages, cognitive changes. So one of the questions we might say, well, do those changes happen gradually over time? Is it a slow shift from one to the other? Or is it more of a kind of sudden jump, right? Do they suddenly have this ability or suddenly have this characteristic that they didn't have, very, very quickly? So that's a question we might ask. How do those things change? How do they develop? And the last one is stability and change. So which of our traits persist through life, and how do we change as we age? So are there certain things that if we look at you when you're 5 years old and we see you have these specific traits, are there certain things that will be the same, when you're 80, 90 years old, you'll have those same traits? Are there things that are different? That's basically this idea of stability and change. What's going to stay the same and what's going to change? So our first section that we're really going to be looking at here is the very beginning. So the way that we're going to do development is we're basically going to start at the very beginning of life, and then as we go through the class, we're going to work our way towards the end of life. So our very, very beginning is the prenatal development and the newborn sections of life. So there's kind of two pieces here. We're kind of mushing them together a little bit, but we have, again, prenatal and then our newborns. Let's move on to our next, move on to the next piece. So prenatal development is the very beginning of human life. So prenatal development begins at conception. So the moment that an egg cell is fertilized by a sperm cell. That is the beginning of prenatal development. And it will continue until birth. So prenatal is pre-birth, before you are born. So it's everything that happens before you are born. Now, generally speaking, a pregnancy is going to last about 38 weeks. Obviously, sometimes it's a little more, sometimes it's a little less. In extreme cases, obviously, it can be far less if there's complications, but generally it's going to be about 38 weeks of development. Now, we can also break up our prenatal development or our prenatal stages, or into 3 stages, I should say. So we have our germinal stage, our embryonic stage, and our fetal stage. Now, I want to kind of point out this little moving piece here on the side. So what it's actually showing us is these different stages of prenatal development. Now, and it's kind of giving us an idea of what's happening. So our first stage is the germinal stage. Now, we're going to get into this a little bit more on the next slide, but just to kind of show you, I think it's nice to see it with this. So our germinal stage begins at conception, again, when the egg cell is fertilized by a sperm cell, and it will continue on for about 2 weeks. So it's a little hard to see here, but if you look, there's kind of like these little bubbles here. These are the weeks. So you can see it says week 1 right about here, and week 2 right about here. So this whole first section is all our germinal stage. You can basically see it's just the development of a cell. Right? If you look at it, you can tell this is just one cell that's developing. Now, from here is where our embryonic stage is going to begin. Our embryonic stage goes from about 2 weeks to 8 weeks. So it starts right about here, and then 8 weeks is right about here, right here. So this section right here is the embryonic section. You can see, obviously, this is connected with an embryo. So we see kind of this embryo right here. You can really see what that looks like. And then our last section is the fetal stage. Our fetal stage will go from 9 weeks until birth. So obviously we're in the fetal stage by far the longest amount of time. So that'll start right about here, and it'll continue on until birth at the very end of this little spiral here. We're going to watch this kind of video that will show a lot of things that are going on during these pieces, but we'll look at that in class. So let's talk about these a little more specifically. Now, when it comes to the AP Psych test, there's obviously tons and tons of things that you could talk about in all of these stages of life. In the video, we'll see it'll talk about all sorts of different organs and body parts and different things developing, basically. Generally speaking, you really just need to know the overall things that are going on. So you really need to know what time frame each stage is going to be during, and then the basic thing that's happening there. Okay, so you do not need to know like specifically when we gain the ability to hear, or specifically when a heart starts beating, or any of those kind of things. It's really more about, I know if they give you, it's 4 weeks old, you need to know what stage that's in. And then you need to know, okay, in general, this is what's basically happening. So again, our first stage is our germinal stage. Starts at conception and goes on to 2 weeks. Again, you can kind of see this development in this GIF over here as well. One of the important terms that you do need to know is what is called a zygote. So all a zygote is a fertilized egg. So we mentioned conception. So when that sperm cell fertilizes the egg cell, now it is considered a zygote. A zygote, basically what's going to be happening in this germinal stage is the zygote is going to be dividing itself over and over and over again. So it starts off, it divides itself into 2, then 4, then 8, 16, and on and on and on and on. Until there are thousands and thousands and thousands of basically little different pieces within that zygote. As that's happening, the egg is moving down the fallopian tube to the uterus, and eventually it will attach to the uterus, and that's where kind of the majority of the development will happen. Now, after that 2 weeks, once that zygote has attached itself to the uterine wall, we'll enter the embryonic stage. Again, the embryonic stage goes from 2 weeks to 8 weeks. This is really mostly what you're seeing in here, at least the beginning part. And what's happening is now all of these little cells that are part of this zygote are going to start differentiating. So early on, when we just are a zygote and we're just this cluster of cells, basically, all of the cells can become anything. This is why, if you've ever heard of like stem cell research or people using stem cells for research or treatments or all sorts of other different things, this is why they can do that. Is basically these zygotic cells are able to become any part of our body, any organ. So that's why they can use them to do research and different things where you couldn't just take a cell from an adult human or anything like that. But that's kind of a side piece. But we get to our embryonic stage, and now what's going to happen is those cells are going to start differentiating. So you can kind of see that if you look once it starts over again in just a few moments. If you look where we started at week 3 and then we move into up to week 8, right? You're seeing basically those cells kind of start off as just all looking kind of the same. And then as it develops, you're going to start noticing different things. You start seeing arms and legs and limbs. You can start to see a face and eyes. And over time, you can see these different pieces developing that would all be different organs. And obviously on the inside, right, there's bones that are developing. You can see some bones in there as well. You can see organs like the heart, the lungs, all these different things would be developing during this time. Now, our next stage, our final stage, again, is the fetal stage. It goes from 9 weeks, so it starts right where this little GIF is going to leave off, and it will go until birth. Now, starting at about 9 weeks, and one way to always kind of, or the one easy way to kind of tell usually if we're in the fetal stage is we'll now look at this and we can actually see that it looks like a baby. It looks like a human being. If we look even right now, that doesn't necessarily look like a human yet, right? And if you look actually at embryos of a whole bunch of different animals, whether it's like lizards or chickens or humans, and you kind of compare them, they all look kind of the same, right? And you'll see that in just a few moments as this kind of pulls up. If you asked, okay, right now, what kind of embryo is this for? What's this going to become? You might not necessarily say a human being. It doesn't really look like one yet. At that 9 weeks, now we really see a human and it looks like a baby. In addition, one of the most important things that's happening is during this time period, these organs are going to actually start functioning. So not only will they be there, but they're going to start working, right? Your heart will be beating, your lungs obviously aren't really breathing because you're in, fluid, but your lungs are able to work, your eyes are able to work, your limbs can move around, which is why babies can kick. All of those things are going to start functioning where when we are out of the womb, we can survive on our own. We can breathe on our own, digest on our own. All those kind of things would be happening during that fetal stage. So from here, we're going to just kind of talk about some important things that are factors in fetal life, or basically what's happening during this prenatal development. So one thing we know is actually during this fetal stage, we actually see a lot of different things. So one is that newborn babies are actually shown to recognize their mother's voice and actually even the language they speak. Although obviously they don't understand what the language is and they aren't able to speak, they do recognize it. So what that tells us is that during development, during that prenatal development, they are able to hear and listen to what's going on around them. In addition, there's actually some studies that have shown that they are able to adapt to other sounds. So for example, let's say your parents live next to a train, and so this train comes by and it makes noise. Over time, you would actually adapt to that sound. That newborn would adapt to that sound while they are in the womb. So again, once they are then born, they actually will continue to recognize that noise as something that they've been around before. So we are, and this kind of connects to our learning stuff earlier, and it'll connect again later on when we talk about other development. But we actually begin learning, before we are even born. Before we're born, our brains are already learning things and making connections and kind of doing these things that we talked about in our learning unit. Some other things we have to talk about with fetal life are some of the dangers or the things that can happen that can cause negative effects. So one term that's pretty important for us is what's called a teratogen. You can see that again at the top there. So generally speaking, a teratogen is pretty much anything that causes harm to an embryo or fetus. So the technical definition says agents such as chemicals and viruses that can reach the embryo or fetus during prenatal development and cause harm. Now, again, teratogens can be a huge variety of different things. When you think about chemicals, chemicals technically are in pretty much anything you ingest, whether it's medications or liquids or even the food you eat. So if you know anybody who recently was pregnant or is pregnant now, you've probably heard them talk about a lot of different foods that you are or aren't supposed to eat, or things you're supposed to stay away from, or things you're supposed to have a lot of, because again, all those chemicals aren't just going to you, the mother, they're going to the developing embryo or fetus as well, and they can cause damage depending on what they are. Alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana smoke and illegal drugs have been linked to a whole bunch of different things like premature birth, low birth weights, low birth weight infants, stillbirth, which is a baby who is born dead, sudden infant death syndrome or SIDS, developmental problems, and attention and behavioral problems as well. SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, is kind of this thing where the baby will be born. They may not necessarily even have any complications, while they're at the hospital. And a short time later, whether they're at home or they're in the hospital, suddenly it just passes away. And there isn't necessarily like an apparent reason always. It's not like they suddenly they see something happen or something happens to them and then it causes this. They kind of just suddenly pass away. So that's what SIDS would be. It's not necessarily, I don't want to say it's uncommon, or I don't want to say it's common necessarily, but it's definitely not uncommon either. One example that we'll look at, because it tends to be, if they're going to bring one up, it tends to be the one they bring up on the AP Psych test, is fetal alcohol syndrome, or FAS or FAS. Fetal alcohol syndrome is physical and cognitive abnormalities in children caused by a pregnant woman's heavy drinking. Now again, obviously you shouldn't be drinking at all if you're pregnant, but generally speaking, if you just became pregnant and it's been a week, you don't know you're pregnant yet, and you had a glass of wine, doesn't necessarily mean your kid's going to have fetal alcohol syndrome. Usually this requires at least a pretty good amount of alcohol intake to kind of cause these different things. Now, again, there's kind of a range, just like a lot of things we talk about. There's some that will be very extreme, some that maybe will be kind of more minor problems. But some of the things that we see with fetal alcohol syndrome are low intelligence, a small head with a flat face. So it's kind of, you can't really see it a ton in this picture here, but their faces will basically be very flat. There isn't, if you turn your head, there's kind of parts of your face stick out, right? Theirs will be very, very flat. Especially their nose. So you can kind of see here, there's no bridge to their nose, right? Now, obviously, I have a really big bridge on my nose, but if you took that and basically just flattened that in, so there kind of just looks like just the nose at the bottom. Tends to have misshapen eyes. They tend to be, I believe, almond shaped, if I remember how they kind of describe them, and a thin upper lip. So their upper lip will be very, very thin. The intellectual impairments range from minor learning disabilities to severe intellectual disabilities. So again, there's a wide variety, but fetal alcohol syndrome is one that's also one that's very easy to generally kind of see, right? There's physical changes that we see that we can, look at a child almost and say, okay, there very well could have been some fetal alcohol syndrome with causing these different disabilities that we're seeing or problems that we're seeing. So we've looked a little bit about some of the kind of things that can happen or things that can affect their life. But now we want to know, okay, what does what we might call a competent or a healthy newborn look like? So one of the biggest things we're going to look for is reflexes. So there's certain kind of things that they look at when a child is born to say, is this child healthy? Is there possibly any problems? Do we need to worry about anything? And one of the big ones is reflexes. So what reflexes are is basically innate behaviors. So human beings don't tend to have a ton of different things that are always considered reflexes, but there tends to be things that we just kind of happen without us thinking. Now, with infants, there's going to be things that are innate that exist from birth. So the second a newborn is born, if they're really healthy, we will see these different reflexes. Now, all of these are obviously unlearned because they've been in the womb. There's no way they could have learned these different behaviors, but they just are naturally ingrained in human beings, in our DNA, I guess, that we have these different reflexes. So when in class, we'll watch this video that will show these different examples, but the big ones are grasping, rooting, sucking, the Moro reflex, stepping, and the Babinski reflex. So grasping is basically this idea that if you, and I'm sure some of you have done this if you've ever been around a baby, if you take your finger and you put it in an infant's hand, even a newborn infant, they'll grab onto it, right? They hang onto your hand. They'll grab onto your finger and hang onto it. So that's grasping. Rooting is basically rooting for a nipple, basically. So if you took your finger and you rubbed it on a newborn baby's cheek, they'll basically turn and open their mouth because they're looking to get fed, which is obviously an important piece. Sucking is obviously very straightforward. They're feeding. We have stepping, which is where if I hold a baby up in the air, their feet will step as if they're, walking on something. We also have the Moro reflex and the Babinski reflex. I feel like I'm going to mix these two up. But one of them is basically this reflex where if I kind of I don't want to say I drop a baby, but if you kind of let a baby down quickly, they'll grab on, right? Like their arms and their legs will kind of grab on as if they're trying to hang on to something. And then the Moro reflex is if you tickle their feet, you'll see their toes will curl as if they're grabbing on as well. Now, all of these reflexes are believed to be evolutionary, which makes sense because, again, there hasn't been any time or way that they could have learned them because they've just been in the womb floating around in liquid, so it doesn't really make sense. But all of them make sense for evolutionary reasons for us to survive. So obviously, rooting and sucking, you need to eat as a baby. So if your baby just doesn't do that, there's not really a way to feed them otherwise, and they would pass away. All of the other ones, grasping, the Moro and Babinski reflexes, and stepping, all have to do with, we believe, early human beings and the need for a child to hold on. So, for example, a long time ago, maybe even before we were, considered Homo sapiens, if we were carrying a child, right, or even if we were climbing trees, but if we were carrying a child with us, there weren't strollers, right? There weren't necessarily ways to wrap our child to our bodies the way we have today, or today there's strollers and carriers and all these different things. So back then, if you were being carried by your mother and for some reason, she was going to drop you and you had a natural instinct to grab and hold on to something, that could very well obviously save your life. And then, evolutionarily, that would get passed down on and on and on until eventually we all just have these reflexes. Another thing that's really important that we see early on, and again, this isn't something that we are necessarily going to look for. They're not going to necessarily do a brain scan on every single baby that's born, but we do see what is called blooming. So blooming is basically this time period where we see really rapid neural growth. So we'll look at this a little later in one of our other units, but we'll basically see the amount of neurons in the brain explode and grow incredibly quickly. And then we'll also connect this later on with also the really rapid pace at which obviously infants, but also young children learn. They learn incredibly quickly compared to adults. And a good reason for this, or a reason why this might be happening, is because of this blooming, this explosion of this neural growth in our brains. Like I said, I'll show you the video so you can kind of see all of these different reflexes individually as well during class. This is just an example. This is actually one of our other AP Psych teachers here in Clark County, their child as they kind of grow up. So we see 1 month here, and then we're going all the way. It is a little weird because it goes 1, 2, 3, and then 4 is here, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and a year, 12 months. So again, we're seeing just kind of the development. You can obviously see the big difference in size. You can see the difference in facial expression, especially at the very early on towards the end. You can see the difference in physical, how they're laying and sitting. At the beginning, if you've ever held a baby, a newborn baby, they can't, their limbs, they just kind of all hang. They don't have the strength to really do a lot of things, where as they get older, right, they're able to lift up their head, they're able to hold up their legs, they're able to move around. So those are all things that we'll see over this first year of life. So that's going to take us and let us talk a little bit about some of the norms of development of early childhood. I'm going to move myself around a little bit as I'm doing this. So once we have our newborn baby, we've detected their reflexes, they look really healthy. Generally from there, that child's going to go home. Now, we do also, though, expect to see certain norms of development over the first kind of year or so of life. So what developmental norms are is basically this kind of normal timeline of mental and physical growth that occur as this child gets older. Now, again, we're really focusing here on, we could take developmental norms through probably through young, not necessarily young adulthood, but through childhood even. But really, usually we're going to focus on infants really. Now there are 6 motor milestones. Now this little chart that we're looking at here actually has 10 pieces here. These aren't all necessarily milestones, but they're basically these different stages. So our 6 motor milestones, there's 4 big ones, which are sitting, crawling, walking, and running. These are the sequence of development that we see that across all children. So basically, every child will go through the same milestones of growing up, right? They'll before they can crawl, they'll learn to sit. Before they can walk, they'll learn to crawl. Before they can run, they'll learn to walk. So we'll see all these different pieces, and as they go, we'll see the same kind of milestones. Now, obviously, like when a child specifically is able to do these different things, isn't always going to be the same. It's usually around the same time, but we will see the same order. So I'm going to move myself so you can see up here a little bit more. So we've got kind of these different pieces that are going on. So as a newborn, generally, if you took a baby and you lay them on their stomach, they're going to lay like this. They're just going to kind of lay there in a fetal position. They can't really do anything. They can't hold up their head. This isn't a milestone, obviously, because they haven't done anything yet. This is kind of just our starting. Right? About a month, we'll see that child be able to kind of lift their chin up. So it's still a struggle, and they can't move anywhere still. So if you still lay that baby down, they can't move. But you'll see them start to be able to lift their head up. At about 2 months, we'll see them holding up their chest, so they're able to push up with their arms and kind of like look around. Now, still at this point, they aren't really able to move, but they are able to kind of push themselves up and look around at about 2 months. At about 4 months, they'll be able to sit with a little bit of support. 7 months, they'll be able to sit on their own. And again, this is one of our big milestones here, is when they are able to sit. At about 9 months, they'll be able to stand with them being able to hold on to something. So I'm sure you've seen this before, and we can actually kind of connect it with the 10 months, which is crawling, which is another huge motor milestone. So you've probably seen, if you've been around a young child, well, they'll crawl around and they maybe will crawl over to a table or a chair. They'll use the chair to kind of like stand up. They'll stand up for a little bit. They'll look around, and then they'll like sit back down, and then they'll crawl, and they'll continue to do that over and over again as they that's how they get around. At about 11 months, they'll be able to walk with support. So, if you give them their hands, you can kind of help them walk. At about the same time, they'll be able to stand on their own, so without support. Now, obviously, this doesn't necessarily mean they're going to have great balance. If you've ever been around a young infant, they don't tend to balance super well. So even though they'll be able to stand, right, they might fall over or sit down on their butt or whatever, but they can stand up on their own without assistance. And then at about a month, they're able to walk on their own. So these are kind of some of the things we tend to see in that first year here. Move myself back up. So this will wrap up our first section. So again, this is all focused on that prenatal development, and then early, a newborn life, basically the first year really. And we'll continue on in our next section, kind of take off right where we left off. Take a few moments, do a quick summary, and I'll see you guys next time.